Hello everyone, Darren here, and welcome to my review for Age of Empires 4. Age of Empires 4 plays very familiar for fans of the franchise and for returning players. In many ways, this almost feels like a modern-day remake rather than a true sequel, as it doesn't really break any new ground or change up the core formula of Age of Empires. And for many, this is great, as too often, beloved franchises try to adapt and modernize by chasing the latest trends, attempting to appeal to everyone, but ultimately alienating their core audience and appealing to no one. In an attempt to play it safe, Age 4 forgoes any real innovation, instead doubling down on the familiar, revisiting the popular medieval time period of Age of Empires 2, and streamlining some of the aspects of the game while also delivering more in-depth and asymmetrical civilizations to play as. The core formula here remains fun, but it's definitely starting to show its age. While a hit of nostalgia is enough for some returning players, and keeping the game largely the same is enough for the hardcore multiplayer boys, there is a middle ground. The strategy fans or historical game fans that maybe wanted Relic to be a bit more ambitious. Maybe push the boundaries a little bit further, to not play it so safe, but to not throw out the entire formula in the process. It's easier said than done for sure, but Age 4 leaves me wanting more, as every hint of a new idea works wonderfully. I only wish Relic had the confidence to expand on their ideas further, but after Dawn of War 3, maybe a safe play is not such a bad thing. Either way, this safe play of a game is quite fun, if you like other Age of Empires games, but if you were never into Age of Empires for the multiplayer, and instead you were hoping for a grounded take on a historical setting and immersive, storied campaign, you won't find that here. The campaigns are fairly basic in terms of what happens, and are told from the third-person perspective like a sort of history documentary. Now, while they do a great job of giving you that historical context and supplying you with further reading in the game itself, you sort of just feel like you're playing with toy soldiers retelling how battles might have happened, rather than reliving them. There's no blood, there's no real sense of violence, there's no immersion. You never stick with a character for more than 2 or 3 missions, so you never really get invested. The campaign does serve as good preparation for multiplayer, sort of mission-based tutorial, if you will, with varied experiences teaching you all about the different aspects of the game, from your basic economy and unit counters to new features like stealth or new playstyles from some of the most different civilizations. I think it's a great entry point into the series if you've never played an Age of Empires game before, but if you have, I think it comes out as one of the weaker campaigns in the series. It has moments of intensity, with big set-piece battles and armies clashing, but it's largely scripted almost all the time, with AI that suffers from tunnel vision for whatever their given objective is. As a result, I consider the campaign to be not great, but not terrible. One nice incentive to have a crack at the campaign is that you get rewarded with little bite-sized documentary videos about various medieval weaponry and practices. Oh, trebuchets. These have been quite enjoyable to watch, maybe a little too enjoyable. Revisiting the real-world locations, you get to see where the events actually took place, and focusing on a particular craft of the time, but of course you could probably just watch these online yourself to save you the trouble. It's a nice thought though, and the OCD collector in me wants to get them all. If you're not a campaign person but you still want a quick guide on how to play, you can check out the Art of War training scenarios. These scenarios literally tell you the basics of the game in just a couple of minutes each, but also provide a small challenge in honing in the most efficient way to do things. Again, quite good at getting new and returning players up to speed before diving into multiplayer co-op.
During this introduction, construct the proper siege weapons to use against your enemy's fortifications and defending forces.
So as we get into the game mechanics, I think for most people, they understand and know what Age of Empires is. I think it'd be fairly pointless to describe the entire formula here and how it plays. Instead, I'll just hit you with the biggest changes that this game brings to the series, and then recap on some of those core features that actually haven't changed. So number 1, landmarks. Normally in Age of Empires, you advance from one age to the next by selecting your town center and paying a lump sum of resources and then waiting a couple of minutes. Now during this time, your town center can't produce new villagers, so early on the flow of the game sort of slows down temporarily. Age of Empires 4 reworks this idea and does 2 very interesting things with it. For one, you now advance ages with your villagers, not your town center. Any villager can build a landmark, which when completed, will advance you to the next age. This is interesting because you can assign more and more villagers to the project to get it done faster, creating a much more dynamic way to advance. You can choose to temporarily sacrifice parts of your economy in order to advance, and how much you sacrifice and how fast you advance is totally up to you. There's a lot more variation in there, which can promote interesting strategy, especially towards the 3rd and 4th age. The second interesting thing is that players have a choice of 2 buildings, which are called landmarks, to choose from in order to advance. Each landmark is unique to their particular civilization, and with 8 civilizations in the game and 3 eras to advance into, that means there's over 40 unique buildings in the game that all do specific things or provide bonuses. Again, super interesting, creates a lot of unique variation, and allows players to decide what's best given their situation. Further to this, landmarks are strategically important, not just for the bonuses they provide, but because they can only be built once, so they're vulnerable to enemy attacks, and further again, if you lose all your landmarks, it's game over. You could do entire videos or series of videos breaking down the landmarks themselves and what they do. Rus, one of my favorite civilizations, has a large hunting cabin that spawns deer over time, and when placed next to trees, it generates gold, twice as much as the regular cabins that they have. That's a fun one because it matters where it's placed as well as what it does. Another worthy mention is the Chinese Great Wall Gatehouse. This has to be placed on existing stone walls, but it increases all stone walls' health by double and boosts nearby troops on walls by 50% for their damage. Again, super interesting landmark because its placement is so important on a strategic level and how you build around it. Finally, I have to mention the Abbasid dynasty, who unlike other civilizations advance the ages through just one landmark that modularly grows outwards over time. It unlocks unique technologies, and then, building inside of its sphere of influence, which can extend outwards, grants you benefits to your tech rate, your villager gather rate, and your production of units rate. It's completely different than anything else, but it's also extremely vulnerable because it is just that one location. So a big thumbs up from me. Relic took a pretty basic feature of advancing through the ages and made it really dynamic, quite complex, and also rich in terms of content and variety. It's certainly subject to some balancing. There are a few choices where I at least don't know why you'd ever take one, but there's definitely others where the choice is so tough that you wish you could have both. Number 2 for our biggest changes are the sacred sites. Now these are small capture zones on the map that can be captured with a priest. Once captured, they generate 100 gold per minute, and owning all the sites triggers a countdown timer to victory. This is something I am a huge fan of currently because it encourages players to venture out of their bases and fight for map control. Now map control has always been pretty important in the Age of Empires community, as you're going to want to venture out and gain control over valuable deposits and prevent other players from accessing them. But Sacred Sites takes it to another level by being renewable. The gold does not run out. Now while it's easy enough to build and defend maybe one of them, it's not easy to build and defend many of them, as they're typically fairly spread out. Then consider as well, you now have landmarks to protect, and it becomes quite the resource drain to try and fortify them early on. Doing it early on also has next to no benefit other than those long-term goals, as they can't be captured until the Castle Age, with priests. So it's actually very well thought out anti-turtle mechanic. There's a few different layers to it as well. If you feel like you're falling behind or you want to create a distraction, capturing the zones can often force a response from the enemy, even if just to buy some time. With an ally, you can sort of spring a trap. If you time it together to capture them in sync, it can be a bit panic-inducing if they weren't expecting it. I really love this system in combination with landmarks, which play off of each other really nicely. Landmarks promote protection and defense, while sacred sites promote map control and offense. The last big change that I want to talk about is pretty quick, and that's the neutral markets. Now typically in Age of Empires you build a marketplace, you make a trader, and you send it to your allies' market. The longer the distance, the more gold they earn, and then they carry it back and deposit it before repeating the journey. This is the same mechanic, except the neutral market is a place anyone can trade to. You don't need an ally. So this is most notably felt in the 1v1 scenarios where you can't trade with anyone, but it's still available in 2v2 and beyond. It's just not that important. These neutral markets can be both on land and sea, and I haven't actually seen it being used too much in the games I've been playing, maybe it's just my skill level, but from a design standpoint, I can see how it adds another layer of risk-reward to the game. On one hand, you can set up trade carts that reach these designations in return, creating an infinite supply of gold, but on the other hand, everyone knows where they are and can harass your trade carts. If you want to be able to utilize them successfully, you have to be willing to defend them and fortify the route to them, so that if an attack does happen, you can actually buy yourself some time while you get to it. This feature also feels somewhat inspired by Age of Empires 3 with its on-map natives and train stations that you can fight over, but it's done a little bit more subtly here. The traders are often well off on the edges of the map so as not to clutter it too much. And I think that approach is really clever and works very well, especially when you consider now the landmarks, the sacred sites. By the end of the game, the map is busier than ever with unique things on it without really detracting from that core experience. I think they've done a good job. So those are the biggest changes to the Age of Empires core formula. There's of course much more nuanced changes per civilization, which we'll get to, but those are the new rules that everyone abides by, and I think they're great. As I said in the beginning, I wish Relic could have pushed it just a bit further, because I really like their new stuff, but a lot of stuff still plays the same, so let's talk about the biggest core features that haven't changed. So to start off, there's still 4 resources: food, wood, stone, and gold, and they basically operate the same as before, with much of your buildings being the same as well: houses, mills, blacksmith, market, university, castles, and so on. You get the idea. If you built it in Age of Empires 2, it's probably here and it's doing the same thing. Again, some players will love the familiar, others might have hoped for something new. There's still 4 eras: Dark, Feudal, Castle, and Imperial. I know that people love the Dark Ages. And you still research technologies and recruit troops in the same way. There's still sheep, wolves, boar, and deer, and they largely work the same, except you can actually carry their carcasses and they don't disappear over time. There's no new on-map animals that I've seen or things to interact with. The population cap of the game is still 200. It's been over 20 years, and that number hasn't changed. I can somewhat understand a tightly balanced game might need to retain this strict population cap, and you do have to consider if there's 8 players, that's 1,600 troops on the battlefield. But I did hope that for custom matches, if you want to have a 2v2 with 800 pop cap each, why not be able to do that? Like, why? Or for the campaign, to create some real spectacle and scale. They could have increased it there, but they didn't. Bigger isn't always better, but it is a lot of fun. Now, just to clarify before we move on, I'm not saying that these familiar mechanics are bad, not at all, but it's important to let people know who might be expecting a bit of a bigger leap forward after the last 15 years and the 3 recent remasters. You could argue that Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition is there, it's popular, and its sequel is now where you could really start to experiment a bit. Maybe you could have pushed the pop cap to 400, introduced a 5th resource, maybe use that for technology or some special late game buildings, just as examples. Some people expect that because if you don't play very often and you come back to this game and it's very similar to the much cheaper and recently updated predecessor, then why spend $60? But for others, the experience is different enough, most likely because they play the game quite regularly. Depends on your perspective as a player and what your expectations are. For me, on the surface, I didn't think there was that much new, and I wasn't immediately a fan of the art style, which we'll get to later. But the gameplay has really grown on me, and I think my next topic will cover why. For a lot of players, the true innovations come from within the civilizations themselves. In Age of Empires 4, each of the 8 civilizations have unique bonuses and buildings, some much more so than others. In the interest of time, I'm just going to mention the most different civilizations. First, we have the Chinese. Now, they've got a unique mechanic called the Dynasty, which allows them to build both of their landmarks in a given age to activate a dynasty bonus. And the dynasties provide units and even buildings, but they are temporary, only allowing you to be in one dynasty at a time. It's effectively a separate age mechanic on top of the age mechanic. They then have the Imperial Official, a unit created in a town center who wanders around collecting tax from any production building. Now, tax is unique to the Chinese. It's essentially just passive gold that's accumulated that your official will have to collect. You're limited to only having 4 officials, and if you prefer, you can actually switch them from collection to Overwatch, where they boost the productivity of a building. Next is my personal favorite, Rus. Rus specialize in wooden fortresses and unique hunting cabins. Their fortresses replace the smaller outpost towers, but also boost production of nearby wood. Their cabins then have a radius where the more tree coverage they have, the more gold they generate, and their wooden walls are also stronger than normal. Their unique mechanic is the bounty. As they hunt animals, they earn gold directly as bounty, and crossing certain thresholds yields benefits to food production. It all sounds pretty great, but the big downside to this early advantage is that Rus cannot build stone walls, and as such have almost no need for stone as a resource, but it does leave them somewhat vulnerable later on in a match. Next is the Delhi Sultanate. Their biggest unique mechanic is that all technology is free, but takes a long time to research. However, placing scholars, or their version of priests, into mosques grants them a tech bonus to anything the mosques are connected to, so you end up with this very organic network of mosques building outwards, and you'll often double up on buildings like blacksmiths just to be able to research multiple things at once. Next is the Mongols. Now these guys are radically different than anything in Age of Empires. They're essentially a horde faction, able to pack up all their stuff and move around the map very fast. They've got no need for houses, and they can't gather stone by hand. There is some early game cheese going on with this civilization, as their mobile town center is extremely fast and can essentially just plonk itself down next to yours and target your villagers as a sort of mobile fortress. Now early on you just really can't do much about it because you don't get rams or really siege tech until a bit later. But if you spot the Mongols in your game doing this, it's best just to build walls very, very early. You can delay the inevitable and then eventually hit them back when you get some siege equipment. Now I'm sure this sort of thing will be tweaked. Making them vulnerable while setting up and giving them a longer wind-up time would probably fix it. Company of Heroes actually has something very similar with the OKW, so I imagine Relic will be on top of it, but it's annoying nonetheless. That's it for the most unique civilizations. The Abbasid dynasty is fairly unique, but we did cover their landmark situation before, and then we have the Holy Roman Empire, the English, and the French, who all play quite traditional, generally speaking. Now, of course, all the civilizations have their own unique units, which to an extent I just have to gloss over because the video will simply go on too long, but they really do have their own unique strengths, and they don't feel like just one-trick ponies. Everything has its counter, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about combat a bit later. They each also have unique buildings, and they also have their own landmark. So there is a decent amount of variation between them, and the more you play and the better you get, hopefully, the more you'll start to see that the subtle differences in civilization bonuses and technologies will play out to create much more dramatic effects than you first thought. I can't stress enough how rewarding it has been to play some proper, new Age of Empires content, but I was thoroughly enjoying my time with the Chinese and the Rus especially, and I feel like I've still only scratched the surface of what they can really do. I've only started experimenting with the Delhi Sultanate, and I can't even imagine fully getting to grips with the Mongols yet. I mean, they are weird. I actually don't know if I love them or if I hate them. So all in all, variety is quite good. Much better than I initially thought from when I first read about the differences. But it doesn't feel like the English, the French, and the Holy Roman Empire are as developed or as interesting as the others. That might just be a familiarity issue because I know how they play. But they do have less unique units than everyone else too. Overall though, I think it's a great sign that there's no one civilization that's just considered terrible to play or extremely weak in comparison to the rest. Relic have done a pretty good job here at appeasing fans of old and new with something for everyone. Alright, let's talk combat, controls, and everything that goes along with it. So this part of my review I fully expect to be the most controversial with some, but I want to open up a dialogue with you about it. Feel free to let me know in the comments where I'm going wrong, but just give me a minute or two to lay out my argument before you jump on me. Now, what we're going to be talking about here all comes down to the idea of micro and creating a further skill gap between players, but at the expense of tedium and frustration. Now, I find movement in this game to be really outdated and finicky. I often want to do something like line up troops in a certain way, space units out on walls, or adjust unit groups and that sort of thing. These actions I have to perform 3 or 4 times each just to get them kind of quite right, and I'm constantly fighting the game's controls in order to move units the way I want to. When it comes to the unit behaviors, there's also less formations, and there's no real defend stance anymore. You can use the stand ground stance, which basically means that units will not move off their specific spot even if the guy next to them is being torn apart. They will stand there and watch, as they've been told to. A defend stance, where they kind of stay in the rough area but they do help out and move a bit, is sorely missed here, as units will either run off and follow the enemy forever or they'll just never move. When you're in combat, units will try to match up against the closest enemies to them, and they'll sort of try to spread out a little bit as well, but you are supposed to sort of micro them around to target units that have been left idle. The same goes for pulling out damaged units. You can't just select the damaged units or see them in the selection UI like in the previous games. Instead, you just have to kind of find them and click them in the world, which can be a bit tedious with all the shuffling around that typically happens in combat. There's other minor annoyances like when building siege equipment, if you select 30 spearmen and you want to put them into a siege tower, the first tower that they get into will become part of your selection and then starts moving with them, despite it being a unit in its own right that you didn't select. Another thing is archers. You can't see their range or get any visual indication of where it is. There's technologies that actually improve their range, and it just makes knowing where that new line is a bit tricky. Some maps have bridges and choke points, and if you wanted to strategically position them so that they're in view of those things, you don't really know for sure if they're going to be in range. If you've got that slight edge over your enemy, that slight range advantage, you just simply won't be able to determine it accurately until you select attack and then see for yourself. Now, I know that I'm giving off some real games journalist vibes here, and I know what some of you may be thinking. Darren, just get good. The game is about micro. Just deal with it. And to a certain extent, I agree. I see where you're coming from. But I think there is a fine line between skill-based micro and tedious micromanagement. For instance, you don't have to reseed your farms anymore. You don't have to manually select villagers and send them to each individual farm. Instead, you just select one farm and they all fan out. You don't have to herd animals anymore. Sheep follow you much faster and more easily. Docks can now repair ships with a big area of effect. You don't have to bring them to the coast and repair them with a villager. There's lots of instances where micro has been cut back, and you could say that having to do those extra steps in the past created more of a skill gap. The players who were better were able to do more, but I would argue that it's not the same as skill-based micro. It's just added micro for the sake of it. Skill-based micro, to me, is managing 150 troops across an entire map in different groups, in different pockets, capturing a sacred site, harassing an enemy, fortifying parts of the map, and building your economy all at the same time. That is skill-based micro to me, being able to manage those many things at once. But when you know what you want to do, but it just takes time because you have to make a bunch of clicks, that's tedious micro. Sure, some people are better at it than others, and I'm the first to admit that I'm not that good at the game. But I'm not sure who's really at a loss of the idea of a defend stance or a drag your line to kind of line up your troops. If I could just drag from left to right to space out troops, that would save a lot of time. I think it'd be great. Here's a couple of things that I'd like to see that I think would make the experience way better, but you tell me if you think it would undermine the RTS micro formula of the game. So the first radical idea I have, I guess, is to be able to select all the damaged units on my screen. So for instance, if I was to hold Alt as a sort of hotkey and drag a box, it would only select the damaged units so I could pull them back more safely. Now the enemy can still pursue them and attack them, but it just means that I'm able to bypass some of the micro of individual clicks and just pull them all out. Normally, you double-click to select a type of unit on your screen, but if you held Alt and you double-clicked, it would select all of that type who were damaged. I would personally really like that, and they could do it too. The next radical idea I have is that when you're making a group, let's say you're making a group of 20 spearmen and 10 archers. Now if a few of them die, I'd like the group to be a blueprint. Maybe you could lock the group, and that way it becomes a blueprint, and if a few people die, you can click a button that says replenish. Then all your barracks and your archery ranges will then queue up new recruits, and they'd automatically make their way to the group to refill it. Right now, you can do this. It's quite easy. What you have to do is, when a few of your guys die, you manually queue up the replacements, and then you click the group, hold shift, add the extra troops, then when they're all selected, you rebind the group, and you give a move order so they all make their way together. It's just messy. It's not that far off just being able to click replenish. It's just more steps. It doesn't make you a better player. I don't think so anyway. Again, maybe this would undermine something in the formula of the game that I'm just not seeing. Maybe Relic actually tried it, I don't know. But I think it would give more room for skill-based micro, leading to more interesting map control and control over armies better. You can picture seeing several pockets of groups and stuff moving around with troops trying to feed back into them as they're replenishing. You could then cut off the sort of supply line of troops that are making their way there. This stuff happens anyway. We're just cutting out some of the steps. To me, this is a natural modernization that still keeps the core of the game intact. It's just more modern control schemes borrowed from the likes of Company of Heroes or Total War. And yes, before you smash your face into the keyboard, I know they're different games. I'm not saying that this needs to be like Total War or Company of Heroes. I'm just saying that those games evolved their control schemes over time, and Age of Empires hasn't. Total War has some of the best controls of any RTS during its battles. Army movement in that game is pretty much perfect now. You can grab anything you want on the battlefield and move it pretty much however you want, groups or not. Company of Heroes is squad-based, but being able to just quickly retreat and replenish troops always feels really great. It gives you more time for maneuvering and tactics. So let me know what you think on that front. I bring up these changes just because it feels like a constant battle for me to control the game. And I put up with it, I get on with it, I win games just fine, it's okay. But if I was making the game, I would simply say, look, we need to make movement as intuitive as possible and give players more freedom when it comes to achieving what they want to do. I don't think placing barriers in the way, in the form of more clicks, makes the game any better, and removing those extra clicks in the examples I mentioned, I don't think it really dumbs it down either. So, controversial topic out of the way, let's talk about the combat itself. It's basically like Age of Empires 2 in many ways in terms of the unit counters, the siege equipment, and the general breakdown of how melee combat and missiles work. There's a bit more active buffs going on, but nothing too crazy, like the Rus warrior monks providing those nearby units with armor, or certain landmarks providing bonuses. Combat collision is a big topic in Age of Empires, and I think it's actually really good here. Collision is quite rigid, so units don't move through each other almost at all when they're actually fighting. Lines will attempt to sort of envelop each other as they look for targets to engage with, and you'll even struggle to move through your own backlines of archers and equipment if you're trying to pull away really fast. This makes emplacement and formations much more deliberate once you learn these rules, as you sort of want everyone to be engaged. You don't want anyone to be idle or looking for an enemy. You want everyone in the fight immediately. For the most part, the pathfinding and the targeting of units will try and spread out a bit to ease your micro, but you will need to get in there, start moving units around to target those idle troops, or prevent too many from trying to bunch up on one. Again, better formations and planning can help this to be much more effective as you go into the fight. Pretty much all the buildings and equipment can be burned and broken down by melee units in earlier eras. They'll throw these little torches which actually do tremendous damage. But once you get to the Imperial era, most buildings will take a long time to break down, so late game gunpowder units will start to come into play. The fortifications built to ward off early attacks can be rendered useless very quickly with bombard cannons blasting walls down in a matter of 2 to 3 volleys. I think for me, I'd like to see walls get a little bit more health or cannons just a little less damage, just slightly. It seems to be extremely fast at the moment. I mean, I guess that's kind of the point of late game technologies, but it really is super fast. I'd like to see a real use for siege towers and rams to kind of complement the cannons, but at the moment it's like you can just demolish the entire walls very quickly. Overall, I think the combat is very fun and very good, despite my little issues with it in terms of controls and ease of access. You know, I think the time to kill and the health and damage for most units seems to be pretty appropriate. Now, I saw people complain that arrows are kind of like homing missiles, and the same with certain artillery, but I never really noticed it as an issue. I mean, they are quite accurate. I do see them miss targets from time to time, but I think Relic were trying to ultimately avoid people just wiggling from side to side and just have a more deliberate kind of combat system, because I don't think that was the intentional design back in the day, that you could just wiggle and avoid pretty much everything, because there was no option for arrows to target the ground, which would have solved that. So they could either leave the wiggle in there and let players attack the ground, or they could make the arrows more accurate and rule out that sort of wiggle gameplay. I think they made the right call. Alright, so for the final topic, I want to talk about the presentation of the game, the graphics, the UI, and the sound. I think the environments of the game look fairly average. There is nice lighting, but the textures can be a bit low resolution at times, and there's significant pop-in when you zoom in just slightly. And if you zoom in all the way, there's a lot of pop-in at the bottom of your screen. It looks almost like it's bugged, as I just can't imagine anyone at Relic was intending for so much pop-in right at the base of the screen only. It's like, oh, we want stuff to, you know, at the very bottom here to look really good. It just didn't make any sense. It seems like the radius around your camera that's handling the LODs is just a bit skewed and a bit broken, because it's causing you to see pop-in when it really should be at the edges of your screen only. You're not supposed to notice it. I've noticed that water and coastlines in particular can look really bad, and it honestly just looks like it's unfinished in comparison to other aspects of the game. We've got water tiles that are actually next to each other, facing in different directions, pushing the waves out. Now, I'm hoping that's kind of a bug, but I'm seeing it regularly reoccur. It could just be a procedural generation error, I guess, that's happening. But there shouldn't be that difficult to be able to make sure that all water tiles face the same direction. That's typically what happens in these types of games. Then we've got ships that actually travel on the water, but they don't break the water in front of them. There's no whitewash behind them. They don't interact with the water that they're on. It looks weird when they move. It's just strange. I haven't seen a game do that in like 15 years. Then you've got the coastlines. They look really jagged with some weird shading and lighting going on. Definitely seems like there's something broken there, because other times it looks actually pretty good. So sometimes it just seems like it's kind of broken. And then we have these big cliffs with this massive stretch texture all the way over it. And the water at the bottom, it's not actually, hitting up against the cliffs. There's no audio for an indication that there is an edge there. It's kind of just clipping right through it, like it's not even there. Overall, the environments, not trying to be controversial or anything here, but I really do think they look like they're from 2010 or maybe even earlier. It's like the lighting definitely brings them up a bit, but the details and the actual texture work just seems really, really basic. I mean, Age of Empires 3 has some of these details that this game doesn't have. And there are arguments for stylistic choices, but not interacting with water. What fucking style is that? Anyway, we'll talk about that more a bit later. But onto a positive note. Buildings, on the other hand, look quite good. They have no pop-in issues. In fact, I don't think they actually reduced their level of detail at all, from what I could tell. And they have much higher resolution textures and detail than anything in the game. Now, when creating different buildings, the ground around them actually changes dynamically into pathways and farms and other little details that really bring the environment to life. It's definitely the best looking aspect of the game. I especially love the stone walls. The system for placing them, first off, is brilliant. Very intuitive, very easy to do, and they kind of conform and blend into the terrain really organically. There's also a good level of detail on the walls with little stone bricks, chipped paint and dirt here and there, and the art style of the buildings is just very clear and very concise, but also detailed. Of course, as well, there's 8 different civilizations, each with their own building models across 4 different eras, so considering the volume of buildings and assets in the game and their detail, I think they've done a really good job here. Now lastly, we have the units and the animations. Now I think the units look really out of place in the game. They seem to have much lower levels of detail than the buildings or the environments, and I think this is actually, again, a sort of an issue with zooming out. If you stay at the maximum zoom out level, here's what a unit looks like. Now if I zoom in just one level lower, just a tiny little nudge of the scroll wheel, they get far more detailed. A cavalry unit's plume changes from one triangle to 2 detailed feathers. Now on close inspection, the units actually look far better than it seems, and their animations are actually very fluid and quite detailed. But I think because we play zoomed out, that they look really low poly and clash with the art style of the buildings. Now hopefully Relic can just fix the LOD issue so they can tie it to the settings, so if you play on high settings you can keep that detail even when zoomed out. Now obviously it still doesn't look that good. I still feel like the units seem really inconsistent with the buildings and then the environments, and people might call it an art style or say they did it to ensure the game runs well, but the game doesn't run well, and I actually find it very difficult to tell units apart because things are so low poly. Unless the unit is very unique, or I zoom in a lot, or it has a lot of color on it, things can look like just a big blue blob or a big red blob when I'm attacking them. It can be kind of hard to identify the more nuanced units in there. I've often confused villagers for longbowmen because, as the English, they carry bows. Those kind of little mistakes happen to me frequently. And I like to think I catch details. Now in terms of performance, I've played the game now on 2 computers. My current PC has been having issues. One of the PCs is about 5 years old, with a GTX 1070 and an i7 5930K CPU, and it's got 24 gigs of RAM, and I could barely maintain 30 FPS on medium settings. Granted, I was playing at 1440p. On my other computer, I have an RTX 3090, a Ryzen 9 5950X, and 32 gigs of 4000 MHz RAM. On the max settings, it runs at about 100 FPS for me at 1440p. Now, not going to be an elitist or anything, but I kind of expect a game that looks like this to run a lot better than that on a 3090. And I would also expect a 60 FPS on an older machine if it's on medium settings. If you've got an older PC, you're going to be playing on the lowest settings just to maintain a good frame rate. Now in terms of stylistic choice, there's also no blood. Bodies disappear just abruptly after a few seconds, and it actually kind of catches your eye, annoyingly. I'd rather they phase out or something. And arrows look like they're sort of like Nerf arrows as they hang in the air after they hit something for a second before disappearing. The smoke and fire trails look really cartoony compared to what's around them. And again, I understand it's an art style, but I don't like it. I'd prefer a more moody and realistic presentation, just with the exact same gameplay. I think it'd be quite easy to be able to tell things apart because of the detail and because of the fact that we have giant blue and red HUD stuff all over the place. It's It's not like I won't be able to tell who's who. I guess the game is just aiming to be more family friendly, and I think considering the average age for players of this franchise is like late 20s, probably early 30s, that just kind of sucks. Now, I really quickly want to mention the music. There's just different themed music for each civilization in the game, and I have to say, I love the Rus music. I'm just a big fan of them generally. Have a listen. Again, this music just didn't seem to fit with this aesthetic of the game. It's very... The music is moody and gritty, and the game just isn't, but, you know, here we are. The last thing to mention is the UI. Now, this one might also be somewhat controversial, but I actually really like the UI. It's very neat, very clean. I find it extremely easy to read. The only thing that tripped me up a bit initially was the blacksmith. There was a lot of icons, they look quite similar, but apart from that, I think it's a very minimalistic but just extremely clear. Now, I know a lot of people like having themed UI, and while sometimes that is nice to have, you know, wooden panels and stone, I just gotta be honest and say I really like this sort of almost brushed metallic dark blue and gold. I just think it's very easy to see what everything means. I actually really like it. It's also nice to have unit groups that display on the left when you assign them, have idle villager buttons, and have clear arrows and lines drawn where units will rally to and things like that. I do wish for those range indicators, as I said before, and an indication of where you're going to line up before actually releasing the click and then seeing where they go. But apart from that, I think they've done a really great job with the UI. It's worth mentioning the main menu and navigation for finding games, getting your daily quests, customizing your profile, learning the civilizations, watching replays and match history, the statistics of the games, and everything I think there has been done very well. I just think the UI and the user experience here overall is brilliant. When it comes to hotkeys, I was able to rebind all of my keys with no issues. I've seen some people complain about key mapping. All I've seen is like comments of people telling me like, oh, what about the key mapping and stuff? And I'm not sure what the problem is. I haven't had any issues. I rebound actually a lot of my controls and had no issues there. I have hotkeys for idle villagers, from idle military units. I have hotkeys for actually moving the camera itself, and then I've changed the entire kind of grid system to be different. So I got no complaints from me because everything I've tried to do I've been able to. So I'm not sure. I'm not a pro player, obviously, so I don't know what I'm missing. So that is it for my Age of Empires 4 review. I think it is a really solid, if a little bit safe, entry into the franchise. Everything new that they're doing, be it the landmarks, the sacred sites, or the unique civilizations, I think has turned out great. And it makes me want more from Relic, more civilizations, new ideas for them to play around with. I'm ultimately a bit disappointed in the campaign and the general look of the units, but I really like the buildings, the sound design, the UI, and obviously the gameplay has me coming back regularly. I feel like I'm getting better, I feel myself getting better, and as someone who really likes kind of realistic and gritty games, I think it speaks to the gameplay's quality that I've been able to somewhat overlook that and just keep coming back anyway. That's it for the video. Thank you very much for watching. Consider becoming a channel member to support reviews like this one, and your channel membership will basically equate to, I think, about 1,800 views at the lowest level, so it's extremely helpful for a smaller channel like mine. So I do appreciate it for those who are channel members, and for those who consider becoming one, also consider joining my Discord at discord.gg/ROP, where you can find like-minded players to chat and play games with, and sometimes argue with as well. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.